There is a slight caveat to democratically elected representatives in the election of the president. As with most design decisions in the Constitution, there were many arguments in opposing directions, and the end result represented an attempt at compromise among the differing perspectives. One of the major issues was a fundamental disagreement about who should be deciding the president in the first place. Under the previous two systems before the Constitution, the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation, we'll discuss these later, the president was appointed by Congress. Some believed that this practice should be retained in the new design of the Constitution. Others believed that the president should be elected by the people. The Electoral College represents a compromise between these two perspectives. It establishes a layer of abstraction at the boundary between each state and the federal government. It creates a transient representative body of officials, the college, for the sole purpose of electing the president. It then apportions chairs within this college to each of the states, in such a way that the power each state has within this college is identical to their power in the federal Congress. The number of electors that each state has is equal to their number of representatives in the House, plus their 2 senators. This allowed the culture within each state to customize the political process in whatever way their people preferred, but to do so in a way that had zero effect on anyone outside that state, because the most that they could do is wield the same amount of power that they already have in Congress. So if a state wishes to defer the decision to its citizens by democratic vote and distribute their decisive power to each candidate proportional to their share of the vote, then they can. And it will not harm any state which chooses to do otherwise. But if another state wishes to maintain the congressional appointment style and have their state legislature select their choice for president, then they can do that too by having the legislature appoint the electors directly, and it will not harm any state which chooses to do otherwise. And in either case, from the federal perspective, with regard to respecting the relative power among the states, the outcome is no different than if the federal Congress had appointed the president directly. However, they were also concerned that this system would devolve into each state just trying to appoint one of their own citizens, and none of the states would agree on anyone, and the president would end up being appointed with a very small amount of overall agreement. So, to solve this, they gave each elector 2 votes, and they added a restriction that at least one of their votes must be for someone who is not an inhabitant of their state. This opened the door for nationwide political parties to serve the role of coordinating unified candidates. Also, in the original design, the winner became president, while the runner-up became vice president. But later, the 12th Amendment changed this process so that they vote for president and vice president explicitly, rather than giving the vice presidency to second place, but the rest of the system is mostly the same. As for how common each one was in the beginning, it's unclear. There are conflicting claims about the prevalence of state appointment versus general election in the early presidential races, and primary sources are very hard to come by. Apparently, back in the day, they didn't think it was important to keep detailed records of historical elections. In fact, the modern-day Office of the Federal Register, part of the U.S. National Archives, is not aware of a centralized, comprehensive source of the names and voting records of presidential electors for all previous presidential elections back to 1789. Govinfo.gov is a service of the United States Government Publishing Office, GPO, which provides free public access to official publications from all 3 branches of the federal government. An official educational document they published in 2011 on the history and purpose of the Electoral College claims that,
quote, "There are no recorded popular vote totals for the first few presidential elections because all of the state legislatures appointed their electors without the direct input of the public. By 1832, all electors except those from South Carolina were chosen by popular vote. End quote.
While that is an official government source, there are multiple other non-government sources claiming the contrary, that some states did use popular vote all the way from the beginning, such as this one, which claims that it was roughly half and half appointment versus election, and this one which claims to have vote tallies by county for presidential elector seats in some of the states, for presidential races going back to 1789, for example, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Regardless, they agree that at least some, perhaps as much as half of the states used appointment in the early years of the country and gradually switched to general elections over time. But this is still merely a state preference. If any state wanted to, they could switch back to presidential appointment by the state legislature. But why would they do that, you ask? Appointment by state legislature. Given the modern culture and the constant mischaracterization of America as a democracy, you might simply take for granted that election by popular vote is a universally superior system. What rationale could oppose that? Well, hopefully we've already established that pure democracy is actually a bad thing via mob rule. So, if nothing else, government appointment would filter the decision through an additional layer of law, and thus reinforce the distinction of a republic. However, there are other, more practical benefits, the biggest of which is limiting the scale of elections for representatives. The larger the election, the bigger the scale of campaigning that is necessary, which requires more resources, time, and logistics, which opens the door for external influences into the process, such as large donors, corporate lobbyists, political favors, etc. This is why the founders favored small electoral districts, to minimize both the need and incentive for such things. But the presidency is a massive election, and he has to campaign on that scale. It's basically, by definition, the worst possible scenario. One representative being elected by the entire country. From the perspective of the founders that wished to retain the congressional appointment of the president, the people have already exercised their elective power in choosing their state legislature and congressional representatives. So if they can't trust those elected officials to choose a proper president, then how could they trust them to pass laws or wield the rest of the governmental power? Also, today, most voters just vote based upon party lines anyway, which is pretty much exactly what state legislatures or Congress would do if we switched to appointment of the president today. So what's the difference? If anything, there'd be basically zero election fraud, in terms of fake votes, in the presidential election, since we could require the state legislature or congressional vote to be public and identifiable, and you would know who each representative voted for, and everyone in the country could audit the presidential appointment themselves, and know exactly who to blame if their preferred candidate didn't win. Imagine if, on what used to be Election Day, instead, at a specific time nationwide, for example 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Mountain, etc., all the legislatures of all the states in the country convened at a single point in time and cast their votes to appoint their state electors on live stream, and posted an official log of the legislature vote on their state government website, with a table showing each of the representatives and who they voted for, and everyone could add it up themselves. We could appoint the president and know the finalized outcome with a full audit trail in 20 minutes, with only the final certification remaining. Switching to state appointment would also restore everyone's recognition that the state elections are important. Today, most people just ignore their state elections, and many even ignore their congressional ones, and only care about the president. By switching to state appointment of the president, it would force those who care about the presidential election to achieve that through electing better people to their state governments, thus restoring more scrutiny at a local level, which can then have more power to intervene federally, as well as do a better job of running each of the states. Final thoughts. All of this is not to say that the Electoral College approach is perfect, but it was the attempted solution which they chose. However, incorporating the presence of such a middleman especially when combined with the abstraction layer of state autonomy, allows the system to accommodate much more creative implementations than we currently use today. For example, if our culture were to restore a deeper sense of community and more formal relations between such communities, a state could even appoint trusted elders from each of the communities to make the decision on behalf of the people of that state. Today, our culture is so variable, and very few unified communities reach such a large scale, that to modern ears, such a proposition may seem ridiculous. And, to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that it would be better. I'm not saying one way or the other. My point is that the system the founders designed is resilient enough to accommodate this degree of drastic cultural differences among the states. The system was designed to allow experimentation and drastically diverse political and cultural beliefs while remaining unified by allowing self-determination and respecting others' right to live as they choose. If California wants to become socialist and impose a 50% income tax, that's their business. If Alaska wants to have virtually no taxes and revert back to mountain men living in the wilderness doing whatever they want and taking the full responsibility and risk of their own survival, that's their right. Or states could appoint trusted elders of their local communities as their electors to let them make the decision. For example, the state could provide equal access for all of its citizens to establish and join in-state community organizations, essentially political parties. Then, the state could distribute its elector seats to these communities proportional to the quantity of their registered members. Then the organization can appoint a number of their trusted elders to each of their controlled seats, and then allow those selected elders to choose whatever presidential candidate they think best, or even debate among each other to help them decide and try to win over others to their side. This could even be broadcast as a debate among the electors. Essentially, the general public would vote for a community by joining it and officially registering as a member of it. Then, if there's a large religious community, then they could appoint their trusted elders to represent their values. Meanwhile, secular citizens could form another political community, which appoints philosophers, scientists, and lawyers as their community elders. And the nationwide political parties could also form a branch in the state for people who just want to put their weight behind whomever the two mainstream parties choose, which is essentially what most people already do today. Or states could break their electors up into different fields of study and hold elections for those elector specialties rather than for the presidential candidate. For example, if the state has 15 elector slots, they could distribute them as 2 scientists, 2 economists, 2 lawyers, 2 cops, 2 veterans, 2 farmers, and 3 wildcard slots. Then, specialists from each of these fields could run for a category, and the 2 or 3 people in each category that get the most votes become those electors. This way you have electors that have specialized knowledge about real life. And, allowing multi-slot categories, which are elected together, you're more likely to get one of each from opposing sides, so that both perspectives are represented. And then, you could have them debate before they cast their votes for president. Or do something similar, but along the appointment route instead of election, and just appoint the head of the state's various departments as their electors, i.e., head of the Department of Education, head of the Department of Labor, etc., whichever departments they believe are the most important, up to however many elector slots they have. Then, let those department heads make the decision. The point is that each state can do whatever they want in order to customize the political process to match their local culture, because people can move to whatever state they agree with. You vote for culture with your feet. The problem is the federal government forbidding one state from deciding its own internal affairs because another state is offended by it. 2 centuries of laws notwithstanding, at least in terms of the original underlying philosophy, as long as each state leaves the others alone, and the individual rights of each citizen are protected, then the states should be free to chart their own path. Popular vote is not the only ethical government structure. As always, for this article's sources, more articles, or to get a copy of the book, visit weepingdragon.com.